Welcome to the Future Series podcast. The Future Series podcast is the new podcast series powered by Benoit, the global family of design specialists committed to delivering world-class solutions for the built environment. The series is going to serve as a thought leadership on all things related to design, architecture, real estate, retail, hospitality, and all the current topics of interest within the built environment realm. My name is Dan Innes, and I'll be your host. And today's topic of discussion is the fabric of place. It's going to take a deeper dive into the world of placemaking. And I think we'll all agree that we've grown up with placemaking now. Everybody that we're working with across the industry, everybody has a different take on what placemaking is, can be defined, how it is, what the meaning of it is, what the values of it are, and people's experience of placemaking. And in keeping with the theme and the approach for the Future Series podcast, we have two guests sitting in front of me here to provide some insight, experience, anecdotes and examples of what placemaking means to them and to get their views and a bit of opinions. Firstly, we have Albert Fielder, who's Creative Director here at Holmes Wood, part of the Handley House group with Benoit. And Albert's began his career in exhibition design, wayfinding and print, originally specialising in graphics, but he's since been working in lots of multidisciplinary teams and repositioning brands through corporate identities, digital engagement, launch campaigns, strategic positioning, art direction and placemaking. He's delivered lots of award-winning work for clients like Rolls-Royce, Greater London Authority, Carl Hansen and Jaguar Land Rover, and is currently working on projects including the Heatherwick studio transformation of Olympia, and together with other work like the Allies and Morrison London College of Fashion and Sadler's Wells East sites on the East Bank in London's Stratford, as well as new humanities buildings for the University of Oxford and several key mixed-use destinations in the UK and Asia. So welcome to Albert. And secondly, a man that needs a little introduction to this future series is Didier Souillat. He led the global expansion of Time Out Market, the most extraordinary food hall brand on earth. And you'll know that there are now several open markets around the world, 7, I think, I'll get that right. And there are several new sites signed around the world, including the first in Japan and in Africa. And most recently, one of its largest markets signed in Riyadh at Didier Square. He first joined Time Out Market as chief exec in February 2016, having served as exec vice president for Hakkasan, overseeing that company's global restaurant portfolio. Previously, Didier held senior management positions in some of the UK's top high-end retail brands, including Harrods, Selfridges, and he also served as director of food and restaurants at MacArthur Glen and managing director at Daylesford Organic. But after nearly 7 years, in December, Didier announced that he was leaving the business to take some time off and away from the business, but to become an advisor. So we look forward to hearing Didier's views on the world of placemaking and his journey towards making some of the most fabulous destinations around the world. So, placemaking. We're going to really dive into all of that with both of you guys and sort of discuss what that really means, because it's used by various different people in different ways, by people who live in places, by the owners, by the investors, by the corporations, by the municipalities. So I think it's a fair question to kick off, maybe with you, Albie, just to understand, what do you think placemaking is, as a short introduction to today's discussion?
So I think what you can see is placemaking having its origins in the 1960s. I think what's really interesting about that as a point in time is you've had a sort of rapid urbanisation. You've had a kind of, for the first time in the early kind of 20th century, you've got more of a kind of populace, so more people living in cities than living in rural areas. And so that the kind of sense of kind of better opportunities, better jobs in the city and things like this. And I think what began to become apparent, and there was suddenly more focus on kind of mid 20th century, was actually moving towards that, what that means in terms of quality of life. And what that means in terms of beginning to build kind of communal spaces that actually kind of operate in terms of, I suppose the language we would use now is kind of wellness and well-being, as a kind of mid-century kind of awareness and a kind of visibility of what those spaces meant for communities. So it's about really a kind of move towards more kind of inclusive spaces. When we talk about placemaking now, we talk about kind of community events and activities, whether it's kind of art installation, art trails, all of those kind of activities. But they definitely have their kind of roots in that moment in the kind of 60s. And then from the 70s onwards, you see the likes of kind of town planning, landscape architects and the like beginning to use that as a term. And I think what's particularly interesting is the idea that placemaking is this, there's almost a bit of a kind of alchemy about it, because it's actually about this kind of, sort of cross-fertilisation of kind of architects and designers, landscape architects and the like. And it's almost sort of what they're capable of together, rather than treating those kind of disciplines in kind of isolation and silos. So I think that's the real kind of compelling power of what placemaking can be.
I love the word alchemy in all of that, because I genuinely feel like not everybody has a definitive answer as to what exactly makes successful placemaking. And I think if we're all regarding ourselves as hopeful alchemists around this table, but certainly I think the roles of all of those people that you mentioned there, the designers, the architects, the planners, the municipality, and all these sorts of different people, but I think it's immediate that placemaking belongs to nobody, really. It should really belong to the community as a whole, and certainly that's been my experience through my career. But certainly from your perspective, though, Albie, in terms of from design, do you see design having had a growing role in placemaking, or do you feel like you are part of a big jigsaw puzzle?
If there could be any positives from the last 2 or 3 years that we've all experienced, I think the emphasis upon placemaking now feels like it's more important than ever. I think living in London, we had that kind of sense of this sort of mass exodus, and then actually people kind of starting to return. I think when you think of cities and kind of urban spaces as being far more than just a place to work, when they're lived to kind of play and enjoy and meet and gather and experience new things, I think placemaking is at the core of that. And I think the point about communities is something we've kind of spoken about before, and I think that kind of comes to the core of this, that this is about kind of creating spaces that feel like they belong to all of us. And so I think it's about making sure that it doesn't feel like it's been something that's been kind of forced upon anyone, but it's a sense of kind of collective ownership. And I think that thing about spaces that invite kind of activity is that it's through those kind of activities that you build memories. It's the memories that build those kind of associations, that kind of loyalty to a place. And I think we'll probably talk about things like reasons to visit places, and then more importantly, kind of reasons to return. And I think placemaking, when it's done successfully, gives you that in kind of spades.
So I think the reasons to visit and getting people to gather, is a real factor. I think the word community is often used widely, and how you engage with that community and what really brings people together, I think is a huge factor. And Didier, coming to you, somebody who has a lot of experience in terms of how to gather people, how to bring people together, not just with brands but with food. What is your take on placemaking? What is your experience of it? What's been your journey and your understanding of it through early stages and through your career?
You said quite a lot on placemaking already, Albie. And what I retained from that really is enhancing the quality of life of a community. And the well-being factor you mentioned, Albie, absolutely. Now, how do you translate that into spaces? The community is you got to capitalize on it. It's an asset. It's an asset, and you need it to be able to develop spaces. Now, if you exploit it the wrong way, it backfires. So you got to be very careful of understanding it first, and understanding that there is an asset worth capitalizing on. It's not always the case. You can't build things anywhere in the world and think because you're going to use such and such and a little bit of this, a bit of that, it's going to happen. Sometime you got to give it time. And I was just thinking of, I'm going to say Dubai. You're going to like, why Dubai? I mean, Dubai's got everything. But think about it. When I looked at Dubai for the market 7 years ago, you're looking at homegrown talent. And I was saying, okay, I'm going to open a market with, at the time we said 25 or something, 25 homegrown talent. And people are looking at me going, where are you going to find 25 homegrown talent? You got an international brand all over the place. But you know what? With time, it happened. And when we did open Dubai with 20 of the best homegrown talent there is, there was plenty to choose from, and it was plenty. So it started by Taman Market is going to open in 5 years from now, whatever, and they're going to take the best of. And suddenly it puts in people's mind, okay, we got to get ready for this, And suddenly, I don't know if we increase the speed of development, but we had something to do with it. And when we started curating, which is, choosing the proper type of content, physically and digitally for that space, there was plenty to choose from. And we've seen now that we're announcing Abu Dhabi, and we're having the same problem. People are saying, Abu Dhabi, God, but so many people have reached out to us already going, when I say to us, my previous company, right? But you understand, I still feel it and breathe it every day. But reached out like, are you coming? And some people are actually going to be developing and experimenting, and some guys from Dubai are going to open shop in Abu Dhabi and reinvent and to move forward and to be part. So I think by coming into spaces, we'll also push the community to get better and quicker. Because that's what we represent, really.
I think there's multiple layers of elements you're talking about there in terms of not just the talent locally, but giving a community an opportunity to create a place. And I think you mentioned it with this 5-year horizon, or however many years it is, 3, 4, 5 years, to say, get ready, this could happen. And there's a lot of ingredients involved in that, if you forgive the food analogy, to bring a great destination and a great place to allow it to even happen. And I think there are lots of different factors. I mean, can you think of any examples where there were some other factors beyond just your own team or the talent that you were trying to amass around you, working with people within the built environment, perhaps, that would provide us with any good examples of creating or curating a positive place?
No, I'm just seeing what's happening now, and that you're involved in Saudi and Diriyah Gate. You've seen what's happening. Jali Terrace has just opened, and they bring international brands, but not only international brands. There's a lot of local brands as well, and local arts and crafts, which they highlight a lot on everything you read about, and it's all based on something real that exists. Al-Turaf, I can't pronounce it properly, but the old Al-Turif, exactly, the old development there. So they have a strong base that they're exploiting and basing, but it's true, it's a fact. And so all this, we're saying we're opening in 2027. Taman Market is opening in 2027. There's plenty of time again to develop. And in terms of art, culture, history, it's all there. All the fabric of that space is already there.
One of the questions, actually, just hearing you describe a current live project, but one of the questions I know several people asked me to raise with you is this the case study in Lisbon? Is what happened in the original Time Out Market? How did that even come together?
No, that's a really good question. How it came together is the idea of a great journalist at the time called Joao, who was the editor of the magazine, which was printed at the time, and in the magazine he obviously talked about the best the city had to offer in terms of chef experiences, cultural activation, and so forth. And then when an old market, Mercado da Ribeira, came to tender, really, where there was half the market was used by, the grocery, the fishmongers, the meat the butchers and so forth. But it was dying. The area was dying. It was part of the red light district. It was not really nice at night, and the vendors themselves were hurting. And Joao had a great idea, saying, "Okay, why don't we bring physically what we talk about in the magazine, and bring the best chefs around and put them together in that space, and bring cultural experiences, and that's how it was created." Simple idea, really well executed. What did happen, though, in terms of, you call it gentrification if you want to, because it made the area better at the end of the day. It was enhanced, that's the word. But the vendors started doing much better because more people, more locals came, more tourists came. The area had a complete rebirth. Now it's a very sought after area in the area in Lisbon, but everybody benefited from it. So a renewed area, people making money, but also the authenticity is still there. The fishmonger that was there 20 years ago, he's still there, and actually he's helping. He is a supplier to some of the vendors in the market. Obviously, we keep it internal. So it's a great story that's worked really, really well. That from this one, we waited a few years before going global with it, because you can't replicate, Lisbon in Dubai at the end of the day. So we need to understand how that worked and to keep the DNA intact and retransplant it into Dubai using local community and local aspects to make it what it is now.
And Albie, do you feel that you followed that kind of journey with other kinds of projects where perhaps there's been like a eureka moment and somebody's just gone, do you know what? Why don't we do this? Why don't we try that? Or why don't we bring in a big anchor or a magnet for the community that would really bring everybody together?
I can't claim to any eureka moments myself. I don't think. I think, but there is something at the core of what Didier is saying there that I think is so fundamental to getting this right, which is actually on a global level. This is about that kind of calibration of the global and the local components. And I think the idea of authenticity and the idea that global brands might be able to kind of support in some way and almost kind of give this kind of platform to kind of elevate the kind of best of the local mix, I think is really, really interesting. I've been looking recently at some of the brands that have gone through a kind of evolution process and have looked at that kind of hyper-local model. And it's really interesting actually because you've got people like Starbucks who have a very, very of a kind of architectural language. So even when you look across Japan, you'll have something that feels like it belongs in Kyoto at kind of low level, like really beautiful, elegant proportions. You'll have something in the kind of rural areas that potentially looks kind of slightly sort of pastiche of historic Japanese architecture. Then you'll go into the kind of Tokyos and you'll have something that feels like a kind of piece of contemporary art that happens to be a cafe. So there's really interesting, I think brands are identifying the fact that juggling of that kind of authenticity and a kind of reflection of their kind of their location and their surroundings is really, really important. The one that I've seen I think is particularly special is Balenciaga have a store in Saint-Tropez where the exterior, so the facade is very, very true to the kind of local vernacular. It's a really kind of beautiful, exquisite old facade. But then you kind of step through that threshold and you're into what they call their kind of raw architecture concept, which is very deliberately unfinished, kind of heavy industrial, kind of concretes and metals and the like. And so you've got this almost kind of transformational experience going from context into this kind of otherworldly space. And even though that's a commercial example, the issues that it brings up of being kind of true to a location and then adding something else that wasn't there before, I think is really, really interesting. So I can't claim a eureka moment, but I think because I think there's so much sort of rationale and understanding of people and place that goes into what we do, that I think that's why I think that the Time Out Markets is such a lovely example of that. It sort of highlights so many of the things done really, really well.
I mean, it seems like there is a sort of an ongoing narrative around bringing in global brands that have the expertise and their household names, and they attract custom But at the same time, having that local authenticity is something that really pervades some of the most successful places around the world. I think one example in terms of things like changes to the urban fabric, things like pedestrianisation of city centres or local areas. I know there's an example in Times Square in New York where retail trade jumped over 70% after a pedestrianisation programme. There are lots of different examples where the urban design and the planning and architecture can have a huge impact. But it depends if you're constricted by the local vernacular, though. I mean, that's key, surely.
Well, I think there's another point there, though, which is when we talk about kind of placemaking in its purest sense, I think if we go back to its kind of roots and talking about kind of public spaces and kind of communal spaces, I don't think you can approach them in terms of a kind of conventional return on investment model. I think in its kind of purest sense, placemaking is about designing these spaces that lend themselves to dwell time and they lend themselves to enjoyable, rewarding time. And then the byproduct of that is increase in spend because of increase in dwell time. So I think there's something that's quite kind of nuanced about that, but I think in its kind of purest sense, the commercial aspect is almost the byproduct of it being successful placemaking.
Mm-hmm. And the gentrification element that you mentioned, Didier, I mean, do you feel that is it possible to have authentic gentrification in this world?
I think yes. If it improves the quality of life of the communities, that's where it starts and has to end, and it's difficult to maintain. But I do think so.
I mean, in terms of thinking about that hyper-local approach and sort of trying to bring in communities and people at grassroots level and doing something for very much the immediate local community. I mean, it's interesting, only last week there was the article in the Times about the protests in Oxford about the 15-minute city, and just thinking about people have a different definition of what the 15-minute city is, but in a sense it's about creating a place that's easily accessible with everything that you need within 15 minutes. But, if you're trying to create something at a local scale, is that a small hub? If you're creating something at a global scale, is it a big hub? I mean, it's all these different sort of things, and it depends which argument you subscribe to. Do you prefer to go to a big destination with the biggest stores, or do you prefer local and authentic brands and local tie-ups with local restaurant groups, those types of things? I mean, do you agree with the local side to it, Didier?
I totally agree with the local side to it. I mean, that's what we've been developing in time now. That's what the brand is about. It's about local, and what you've seen during the pandemic of the local bit becoming hyper local. That's the word I used, because we're not only using vendors that were from the county, they were from the city, and they were from the same borough sometimes. So it was always about the sustainability of the products, the vendors, the staffing, how long it took to come to work. So this 15-minute city was always about the 15-minute vendor as well, in a certain way. They got to come close. The product needs to come close. So yeah, that was very, very important about the localization and the hyper-local and working with the community, yeah.
You say the product has to become close. Is that for freshness, provenance, or...
Yeah, and they're more concerned about these days about miles flown by the local cucumber. I mean, at the end of the day, it's important. It is important, and the customer that you get more and more is worried about this and wants to understand more. But
we've been looking at a project in Singapore called Sky Greens, which is a urban vertical farming development. And in terms of the hyper-local, there's something about being able to grow produce within a stone throw of where you might be able to serve fresh produce that just feels really, really compelling at the moment. And I think the fact that technology might be able to facilitate that with things like vertical farming, it feels like a really exciting moment in time where you can suddenly have this breakthrough where technology facilitates something that there is a genuine appetite for. And that comes from a good place. It comes from a a want for better quality of life and better quality of food on your doorstep, and people can't argue with that anymore, I don't think.
I agree.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think just before we move on the topic, I think one of the most fascinating case studies, which is still a vision, is the line with NEOM, and the idea that a new city or a new place in terms of placemaking is vertical, and everything should be, again, within typically a 15-minute journey of some type. But what is your view about the future of placemaking? How do you see it? Do you see it as a series of regeneration projects in cities around the world, or do you see it as a brand new, shiny destination that's built from scratch?
It's about pedestrianisation of the areas, right? People are going to want to walk everywhere, and that's gonna move a little bit the urban planning mentality that cities have at the moment. The infrastructures of the cities are going to have to change dramatically, and if NEOM is creating it from scratch, they got this in mind already. But I think it's not about public transport. It's going to be about being able to walk and to go everywhere you need within 15 or 20 minutes of walking distance. And I think this is where the placemaking is evolving, in my view.
Albie?
I think the important thing about this is sort of context and history. I think plays like really into this theme, and I think when we talk about successful redevelopments, we often talk at work about Coldrops Yard, and I think there's something really interesting about that, because when I first moved to London, Coldrops Yard was somewhere you didn't want to end up in, that part of King's Cross, any time after dark. And actually now it's a really, really desirable location, and the kind of architectural material palette that's been given is a reference to its kind of big industrial heritage. And I think as a Brit living on a small island, I think that kind of pride that we have in a lot of our heritage, I think when you're able to turn that into something that feels more future focused but references history while looking forward, for me that's a really interesting space to be in. I also think in terms of kind of dense urban areas, I think people need those kind of places of calm and those kind of pockets of calm as well. And I think things like parks and gardens, and actually the way in which those kind of spaces are organised to find kind of little moments of kind of solace and retreat is really, really important as well. So we're not talking always about big markets or festivals or things. We're actually talking about finding those moments in time that make the rest of our life kind of tolerable in these places as well. I think that's a really important part of this too.
Mm. You're talking about drop courtyards at the moment. So in terms of architectural, I totally agree with what you said. But in terms of the brands there, do you think, it's a question, that they actually fit the community there? Because a lot of the brands that were put in the beginning and still now are hurting. If they're hurting means they don't respond to a need that is expressed by people living there. So there's a mismatch. And I've seen that in certain areas. I mean, think Covent Garden for the moment. It was a garden. It was, the other day, the brands coming up here are great for tourists, but they're not really for locals anymore. So there's a bit mismatched matter in terms of that placemaking that ticks a box in terms of development, of look, of architectural, that fits all the criterias. We kept this, but then who you put in doesn't.
I think there's an element there of talking about creating a destination and actually getting people to travel to go and see those kinds of brands. And I'm sure that Samsung were feeling that when they took that the space under the Thomas Heatherwick roof. But I also sense that with Coldrops Yard, it's a growing community, and the arrival of Google in full force, whenever that fully is. I'm not sure quite if anybody knows, anyone around the table here, if it's next year when it will be completed. But having that sheer number of employees on the doorstep each day in, day out, I'm sure will have an enormous impact.
With Google, we thought about that when we were open in Chicago. Google was a block away from Town Market, Chicago. They got a great breakfast, they got a great lunch, they got a great afternoon tea, and a great cocktails. And you know what? They don't come out much. could they work? So if you count only on that spectrum of people to make your market or your concept to work, it's not enough.
Mm-hmm. I guess this is a great case study of creating place is everything else that's there in that community, the cinema, the supermarket, the other needs, and as you say, the new residential developments who are there further up into the King's Cross campus. But yeah, I think the idea of gentrifying areas that need regeneration is one aspect of placemaking, but then these new developments that are, I think the definition of a brand new development has also changed over the last 10 years and certainly the last 20 years in terms of what do you deliver, in terms of what it would have been a covered mall, 15 years ago, whereas as you referenced earlier, Didier, the Didier Square project is an open streets and squares master plan in a hot country. And it's because people do want fresh air. They want to be out and walking rather than in an enclosed kind of space. But from a design perspective, Albie, what are you seeing out there around the world?
Well, I think something you just said is really interesting, because we were talking to a client in the Far East only this week who was saying that you're living in a much hotter climate than we experience here, but people are having vitamin D deficiencies because they're spending all of their time in kind of indoor air-conditioned spaces. They're not actually getting out in daylight. And so I think even in those hotter climates where there are challenges about how you can have enjoyable time in those outdoor spaces, I think that's going to become more and more of a challenge, because there is a genuine requirement from it. And I think we keep on coming back to wellness in this conversation. I think placemaking clearly has so much to do with quality of life and experiences. And so something like that becomes a genuine, a very overt kind of hygiene factor about what we need these spaces to do and how people can experience these spaces.
Is it a multi-sensory experience in terms of not just where you work and live, but also where you relax, but also what you taste and what you see and what you smell, what you hear? All of those sorts of different factors are really becoming, coming into play as part of this fabric that we're building up here.
They really are, and I think people see the senses as those. The senses become the kind of triggers for those memories. So I think the more kind of sensory components that kind of populate and people can experience throughout a space, I think the more opportunities there are to kind of build these kind of moments of kind of reflection and memory and things like that. And I think that's really special about the kind of calibration of how you get these kind of spaces to work.
And do you think that is an underexplored area? Do you think that's somewhere that we could see the future of placemaking coming back to my earlier question of what is what do you feel is the future of placemaking? Where do you see there's scope for improvement or change?
I think we might talk about kind of tech at some point. I think on a more kind of tangible and kind of tactile level, I think we can obviously look a lot to kind of artists and the way in which they create immersive experiences. I think placemaking, kind of one end of the spectrum, can be this kind of elevating local talent and things like this. At the other end, it can almost be this kind of transportation into some kind of otherworldly experience. It can feel like immersive theatre, or it can feel like something you've never experienced anywhere else. And I think the fact that placemaking can be all of those things in between that is really, really interesting. And I would say, kind of caveating that, is there is a point that a space still needs to have its own identity. So in the way that we've spoken about kind of curating spaces, I think that almost needs to be driven by a kind of some principles for that space and actually what that space means, so that people feel a kind of genuine, almost like a kind of sense of authenticity and about a kind of sincerity of that place, I think is really, really important. And so I think that's why when we're talking about some of these key destinations, I think in our minds we have a sense of what that place stands for. And I think that's a really nice kind of sentiment to think that they kind of define themselves by how they operate and how they present themselves and what they offer to visitors.
And just coming to you, Didier, in terms of someone who's worked on the tenant side in some of these locations, from Time Out Market, but also we were, hearing about Dalesford Organic or Harrods or Selfridges. Do you feel like you're instructed on how to behave in these locations and destinations and places, or do you feel like you're part of that conversation and you can actually contribute to that?
No, I think we have been in all those brands part of the conversation. You obviously have to understand the dynamics of the culture and the community before making any statements and wanting to go in there. But you really are part. After a while, you become part of it, and it's always been, the aim is always to be seen by the local community as, a brand has always been around. It's not like, oh, come here last week or last month or year. It's always been around, part of it, and there for the long term. But I want to come back on one thing. It's about newness and novelty about those placemaking. Perhaps I'm jumping the gun if you had a question or not. But, you create all that, and then it becomes static, and then becomes nothing happens for the next 5 or 10 years, and then you lose interest. And I was thinking about that the other day, about how probably the rental models going forward are going to have to evolve, because you can't just come in and say, okay, I've got a space here, you rent this, and for the next 10 years, because you spend so much money renovating it or whatever, that's it. That's all you can offer, And if everything is like that in a space that has been created, then there's no movement, and boredom comes in, and then less traction and less visitors and so on. So you've got to change that model. And I think this is what the malls, department stores have been doing for many, many years, especially malls, right, where they go around saying, oh, we got a space for a burger joint here. Great, let's go and find the greatest burger joint the city has, right? And then they make the guy sign a 10-year lease, right? And then they make him pay, I don't know how many hundreds of thousands of renovation in there. And then they pay marketing fees and PR fees and minimum guarantee fees and percentage rent and everything else. And at the end of the day, after a while, this guy who's the burger operator, well, he's trying to make money, so there's people around, the footfall is there, so he starts creaming it, right? Is he the best after a year or two? Probably not. He's just creaming it now. So what happens for the next 7 or 8 years, So we've been very, very careful in our mix and making sure that people have clause contracts for 1 year, and we help them, obviously, in terms of paying the shop fit and everything else, so that they have the flexibility of wanting to stay or being able to go, or we can also replace them. So there's always novelty, and you're always, not the space can't be static. What is happening? Things go quick, much and much faster every year.
Yeah, Albie was mentioning, things like art trails, seasonal campaigns, other events, activations, brand launches, all these sorts of different things. Are these an integral part of?
They are an integral
of it
part
all?
of yeah, absolutely.
And were you closely, driving that wherever Time Out Market was as well?
The magazine itself, the media platform is all about culture and fashion, about what's happening in the city at a particular time, and the markers are the physical space to represent that. So the phygital experience, started in Time Out long time before we start speaking about it in MAPIC, really, because that's exactly what was happening. So, and people will come for the food, but as everything else, it's a full experience, and it doesn't come only from the food. It's whatever you can take every time you come to a market or to a development, what you can take back. And you talked about, Albie, about this emotional experiences. Yeah, what memories do you have that we've been able to create for for an experience, but something that's memorable.
And that multi-channel, multi-sensory kind of level, I mean, in the introduction, Albie, we were talking about some of your digital experience and how that now is also part of the overlay of this fabric. What direction are we going in with the world of tech and digital for placemaking?
Well, obviously, we're at a really, really interesting point here where I think that the potential at the moment is that you have great physical space, and then the digital overlay of that means you have a particular place where you can is the only place where you can experience something. And I think we were talking years and years ago in a previous company to gorillas about something very similar to something they've just done in Times Square and Piccadilly Circus. And that idea of a shared moment, which is a concert in AR in a public space, for me seems really, really powerful, because it's a really kind of creative moment. It's pushing tech in terms of what it's kind of capable of at the moment, but it's actually bringing together people for a particular moment in time to all kind of have this kind of shared experience of that moment in time. And I think there's something really powerful about that. And I think what we're kind of seeing in really interesting examples is where you go to a physical space to experience something that you can't get being sat at home on your sofa on your mobile, or you can't get from an app or surfing or whatever. It's about the blend of the digital with the physical. There's a chain of supermarkets in China they're called Fresh Hippo, and I've seen a video of the quality of experience there is really, really smart, because you walk into what looks like a conventional supermarket, and every item has a QR code on it, and you can scan the QR code and it will give you a level of information like where that produce has been grown, who's grown it, what the dietary information of it is, what kind of recipes you could use that in, and things like this. And you can kind of curate your shopping basket, but then elsewhere in the supermarket, you can then pass your shopping over to a chef who will then create a meal for you based upon those items that you've kind of curated for yourself. And I think that level of the combination of the physical and the digital, that feels really kind of special. That feels like that almost just feels like you're beginning to find ways in which it's actually kind of physical matter and digital coming together that become really, really interesting. And I think there's maybe things like we at Holmes Wood like to talk about kind of narratives and history and looking back to find interesting meaning and things. And I think digital is a mechanic for kind of storytelling and kind of sort of peeling back layers and finding the history of a space is a really interesting way of thinking of it too. So I think it feels like there's so many ways in which this can work. And something like the gorillas thing is interesting because it's a kind of a common experience for multiple people. And I think the thing about the Fresh Hippo is really interesting because it's a very tailored, bespoke, personalised experience that's really instant. So I think when you think of the potential of those extremes and everywhere in between, there's something really nice in that as well.
Can technology do more than just give you better access to information? Information about what's there, what's in it, what can you make with it, all those sorts of things. I mean, did technology have an impact on Time Out Market over the last decade in terms of the way you ran that business?
I think it did, especially during the pandemic. I think everybody improved in terms of tech tremendously. What normally took 2 or 3 years was done in 3 months. It was a survival mode really to get into tech. We've always seen it at the time of giving people a choice. If you want to go and speak to a chef, understanding and discuss with him and what he's doing, you can do that. If you're not interested and you just want to eat the food, you can press the button on your tab and it'll get to you, and you get that information. You'll miss the interaction. It'll get quicker, but at least you get people to give a choice. It's always about that. But also with tech now, you're getting a lot more information about who you are. Obviously, it's data. But when you repeat, it's nice to know what people like, what their preferences are, and be able to recommend them and guide them in a certain direction. So I think tech will bring that.
Which were the most technologically advanced cities that you'd worked with of all of the different stores in the portfolio?
Dubai definitely was up there very quickly the moment we got all these apps out and people got it really, really quickly to see how it worked. And the repeat business we got on the app of ordering was really, really quick compared to everything else, even in the States.
And just thinking about the way this multi-sensory kind of approach to placemaking is working, clearly food is one of the biggest gatherers of people. And Didier, with Time Out Market and indeed some of the other brands you've been involved with, how have you seen that in terms of developing an exciting food offer? And actually, what does an exciting food offer look like?
It's visually very strong impact, and so many things happen at the same time that you don't know where to look. But it's not about smells though, because imagine 20 kitchens all having their different smell. It becomes, we're pretty good at having great extract systems. But what we've seen is the multitude of offers to get a certain authority, to get people to experience things they would normally don't, and be able to share. And you go back to this placemaking about community, making life better. And I've seen, we always love to see 3 generations of the same family eating together a meal, and everybody eating different things, right? And everybody sharing, but they're all together because, there's enough for everybody. But also what we saw in Dubai, which was amazing, is to see, you have a table of an English family, and the father is having a beer, mother's having a glass of wine, but right next to the same table, you have a family of Emiratis eating together, and then they're communicating. It doesn't matter if somebody's having a glass of wine, somebody's having a juice or whatever, but then people are like, okay, what are you having? What are you having? Can I have some of that? And it's been really exactly what we wanted it to become, building communities and strengthening the connections between communities. And that's why I think those markets have been absolutely fantastic in creating that.
And it would be remiss of me not to ask one big question to each of you before the closing of this podcast, and that's to ask you each, what is your favourite place in the world right now that you can think of in terms of spending some time that brings the right food, environment, and the multi-sensory experience that we've been referring to?
It's funny. It's just there's a small restaurant in Mumbai, of all places, that has become my favorite restaurant in the world, and I haven't been back for about 6-7 years now. But it is exactly that. It's called Trishna. They have one here, but it's not the same. The buffalo milk is different. The water is different. The butter is different. So it's not the same taste. The garlic is different. But when you go there, it's the only restaurant where I went there for lunch once, and I went back for dinner. All right, it just tell you the experience and the taste and the flavors and the smell and everything around it, and it's emotionally amazing. I'd like to be back there as soon as I can.
Sounds good. Alvi, do you have anything anywhere that comes up?
I'm afraid mine's not quite as exotic. I think I'd have to opt for the South Bank on the Thames. For sort of many, many reasons. I think when I first moved to London, I was living in southeast London, so getting the train into Charing Cross, it felt like the boundary and the kind of entrance into kind of central London proper. And I think in my kind of first few years of being in London, you saw things like the Tate Modern opening up there. You saw that kind of transformation of the South Bank Centre into this like big open F&B offer there as well. So actually the idea of kind of like food markets coming in, I think the fact that you've protected those spaces for the guys to be doing like skateboarding on such a kind of premium piece of real estate, I think is really, really interesting. It feels like there's a kind of eclectic and a kind of really kind of inclusive spirit there. So you can have a family trip out, or you can have a trip out with your friends and be in an amazing rooftop bar with a view over the Thames. And I think it just kind of sums up for me what a brilliant space is that serves kind of multiple communities. So not just one kind of generic local community, but a series of loves of different pockets of the arts, or I know there's kind of sort of gardening, sort of rooftop gardens and things there. So I just think it just kind of embodies everything about what a kind of progressive, inclusive city should be.
Great. Well, thank you very, very much indeed, both of you, for taking part in this edition of the Future Series podcast. And thank you very much indeed for listening today. And this podcast is going to be available wherever you get your podcasts, and we do hope you log in to listen to us again soon.